I'm delighted to be here. It's not exactly the same as being in Istanbul, but anyway, delighted to be here. Looking at COVID-19 and the extent to which the entire world now is experiencing this global pandemic, it drives home a number of issues, both about the world in which we live that sometimes we don't think about. That is, that in fact, globalization means interconnectedness, and interconnectedness has both positive sides. That is, that we should be concerned about what's happening not only where we are, but in other parts of the world, whether we're talking about rights, democratization, the environment, et cetera. But also, as we've seen, certainly in a post 9/11 world, that we need to be concerned about those that threaten those rights, not only extremist groups, but also at times governments in the world itself. What we've seen with the pandemic is that for many people who probably didn't think about it, suddenly they are watching every day and following what's going on in the world. I mean, it's amazing how the average person who probably wouldn't even look at, if you will, what's happening internationally on a regular basis, almost every day puts on the TV, the radio, or will read the first thing in the morning to see things like, you know, where is COVID-19 really showing its strength, in what countries, how has it grown, et cetera. And then also looking in terms of their own country and being very concerned about the safety and security, but also economic security. For many, they have come to realize that, again, the interconnectedness of this world means that unlike in the past where we might ignore a crisis that occurred in another country feeling that doesn't really impact me, now we see in this global situation the extent to which, for example, internationally, wealth and investment across the world has been affected. Jobs have been affected enormously. People across the world losing their jobs, not simply because of something that's going wrong in their country, but something that's going wrong in a globalized situation with a global company that may be situated in Silicon Valley in California, but in fact may have plants in China or Bangladesh, et cetera. I think that the spread and impact globally has been expressed and heightened, therefore, concern, communications, and also cooperation among many government leaders, international medical experts, NGOs, religious organizations, and companies, to just look at the leaders that might not really get along, or might say that they get along when we know, in fact, that they really don't. For example, when President Trump talks about or celebrates his good friend in North Korea or his close relationship with the head of China, we know that that's a stretch of the imagination at times on both sides. But now there's much more of a sense, even among those governments and leaders that might have ignored each other or that might have been in contention, that they share something in common. That is, that they may need the technology and services from outside, or that they have technology and services that can not only work for them, but that they can use to export, both because they want to help an ally, but also because there may be something in it for them. I think that for the average person, it drives home the sense of just how incredibly interconnected we are, both domestically and internationally. In other words, what goes on in, let's say, California, which is far from the East Coast, is no longer simply something where somebody sees it the way they might see, for example, the impact of a monsoon, and not really be totally concerned about how it's going to hit them, or not even feel I ought to be concerned about that. In this case, there is the sense that I ought to be concerned about that because it's not only there, it's in these other states, it's getting closer. And then also wanting to know, when we look at the other states, what does the track record look like in terms of the number of survivors, in terms of what one needs to do. And then you have the interconnection of, if you will, the medical experts, who not only are brought in for the information which they possess, but who are brought in order to work towards various laboratories all over the world to work towards and at times coordinate in seeking for a cure, in seeking for a vaccine. And anybody who reads the newspapers, again, almost every day, sees the various projections about what are the possibilities of getting the vaccine? How long might it take? Or other projections just talk about the different projections about how many more people will be killed in the near term. And or the concern about, is this just something that's going to pass away? Or is this going to be like dangerous flus that pass away and then come back almost every year? You know, and what would that mean? What would that look like? Now, there are challenges that come from this. Challenges first, and in many ways, it's not so much a challenge, it's really an awareness that has been rather remarkable. You know, we're used to celebrating powerful leaders, we're used to celebrating powerful scientists who win awards, but now you have populations who not only celebrate on the internet and in media, but will stand out every morning or every night to applaud the doctors, the nurses, the first responders, the caretakers, as they see them going off to work or coming home, realizing and appreciating, even maybe for the first time in their life, just how much these people are really putting their lives on the line. And remember that many of these doctors, etc., certainly have been used to dealing with people, but very often people who are dying, but not in a situation where the doctor and the nurse themselves could feel that every day they would be working with lots of people and risk themselves infection. And we see stories about how so many of these people, for the first time in their lives, feel the need to write a will or write a remembrance for their children or their family. Some very interesting and important challenges, though, are there. And that is the challenges to countries, to governments, and to international organizations like the International Monetary Fund, to provide financial and economic assistance to populations and support families. And that's been a really new challenge. I mean, in every country, there's a debate often about what the taxes should look like, what money should be spent on, should there be support to help those that are poor in the country. But now we're talking about dramatic change that is necessary. A dramatic change that, for example, found the United States putting aside $2 trillion and knowing that this is probably the first in a number of projects that have to be approved and implemented in order to support the economic system from failing. We don't want to have another depression, for example, and in order to support all of those people now, the tens of thousands, and it'll be hundreds of thousands in many cases, who are losing their jobs, are unemployed, don't know where, there's no paycheck coming in, don't know where they're going to get food in terms of eating or the money for their rent. Those challenges are very important, and they in particular really put, it seems to me, pressure on governments and on populations to realize what needs to be done and the degree that it needs to be done. Now, part of the problem, we call this the good, the bad, and the ugly, is that in fact, these situations also can be used or hijacked by leaders who are more concerned about their popularity, about their being reelected, and not really sufficiently concerned about making sure that number one is security, because you have to have number one, security, if you want to have number two, which is economic development and growth. If you don't have the security, you lose half your population potentially, or a good deal of your population. And so at times, there is a sense when one looks at countries and what they're doing, that certainly in the early stages, that things were getting a bit frivolous, or a more important and dangerous one, that leaders who didn't want at home or abroad to see anything too negative happening for fear that it would affect their image in the world, avoid giving the actual statistics on what's actually happening. How many are sick, how many are dying, etc. But I think also the extent to which we have a plague now, not just a minor virus, has also made more and more governments or leaders having to be more honest about it, and media pressing on that honesty. In other words, the extent to which it's happening, if you get too light on your numbers, you leave yourself very vulnerable to criticism. We see the tension at times between the World Health Organization and specific governments, or within a country between the government leadership and their expert scientists. While they may have a working relationship, at times when you start to get into the question that we're seeing today, how fast can we get the economy going again? Then it gets really testy in a situation where your scientists may look at a situation and say, yes, we need to get to the economy, but we can't do that if we're not out of the woods, as it were, a bit more. We can't do that if we're still in a very dangerous situation, in which if we then open up the system, we then wind up putting populations close together again, et cetera. That will just, rather than flattening the curve, it will actually just bring it back again. Another major area, I think, that can be a very positive area is the area of religion. But as with religion, it can be positive and negative. But certainly in the positive side, we've seen for years, certainly in recent decades, the growth of religious pluralism and interfaith relations. I'm old enough to remember a time when I was growing up that really followers of almost every religion believed that their religion was right and that other people were wrong. And if we were looking, at, for example, a number of the major Christian groups and Muslims and some Jews, for example, there would be the sense that I have the true faith, and not I have the true faith, but others also have access to God. Rather, if I'm right, you must be wrong. If I'm going to be saved, because I'm following the right path, you're necessarily going to go to hell, be damned, etc. We've seen a lot of growth in the area in terms of moving, in terms of religious pluralism. Interfaith gatherings, dialogue gatherings. Again, I'm old enough to remember when the first major interfaith dialogue was taking place in the United States, for example. In fact, in the first one that was done, I was asked to be the Muslim. And I remember saying to them, I'm a scholar of Islam, but I'm not a Muslim. And they said, well, we need somebody to present a Muslim perspective. And at that time, they didn't have anyone who was grounded in the faith, in the faith itself. So what we do see then is a way in which, for example, groups like groups that deal with religion and world peace, groups within churches, when we look at statements by, for example, Pope Francis, and also actions, and we see statements and actions by Protestant and Jewish leaders that are very positive, very interfaith, very much in effect saying our community is not just our community in its narrow sense, in other words, our faith community, but we are part of a world which God created all of us, and God wanted to see the world and people living in that world following and pursuing the truth and creating just societies. And so therefore you see a much more international connection. And also when you look at a number of the religious, what would you call them? Religious services out there, relief agencies, a number of the relief agencies now, as in the past, don't simply deal with their own faith. So for example, Muslim relief or Catholic relief, etc. But they also, if they're in areas where there are others, they're responding to those needs. The negative side is that we still have a fair number of religious leaders, as well as people, that are very far right and that are anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim. And indeed, there are also those that are anti-Christian. And for some of those folks, there's an inability to step forward and respond to that. And in fact, there's an ignoring and just worrying about one's own community. Or there are the absurd statements that are made, such as the statement attributed to Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham. And Franklin Graham is nothing like his father. Franklin Graham has had a problem with Islam for ages, saying, that in effect, Islam is the enemy. Sounding a lot like President Trump with his statement, Islam hates us. Franklin Graham more recently talked about the fact that what we were seeing is a punishment, if I remember correctly, I don't have the exact words, that's coming because of President Obama being elected president. Franklin Graham also was somebody who believed that President Obama was a Muslim. But it's also other what we might call preachers of hate that push this kind of anti, as it were, other religions attitude. So we see it, for example, with the far right politically, let alone religiously, the far right politically, and at times religiously, in Europe, in America, in India today, in which you have a movement against people who are not white, a movement against immigrants, a movement against Muslims, and many of the immigrants in recent years have been Muslim, and a rhetoric that incites and can, if it's not careful, incite violence. And we have seen examples where, for example, the coronavirus is somehow associated with Muslims. Now, we can see that sometimes in mainstream media when they have pictures of mainstream Muslims or mosques and use it in a story which has nothing to do with the particular story, which is one that's dealing with coronavirus, which is dealing with what are the causes of it, etc. But you can look at a country like India today, and in India, which has been in recent years under Mr. Modi, moving more and more in a kind of anti-Muslim approach, and you've had violence and killing of Muslims in the last couple of years, and an attempt to disenfranchise them. More recently, you had the health minister blaming Tablighi Jamaat for the breakout of coronavirus in India, and then you had again this violence against Muslims there. One other area that ought to be, I think, of deep concern is the, well, let me say something positive before I get to another area of deep concern. On the positive side, when we actually look at stories coming out in the US, the UK, and in the EU, we see more and more of a recognition in this pandemic of the role of ethnic minorities. There's a very good piece on England and showed how, I think it was a week or two ago, out of 10 physicians that died, 6 or 8 of them had Muslim backgrounds, for example. But there are lots of stories along that line where you see first, second, and third generation immigrants that are living and working in places like Britain and in other countries, the United States, et cetera, who are among of the first responders, many of those who are every day going to work and putting their lives on the line. I can think of this just the other day. I received a text message from a Muslim physician that I know, who's probably in his 60s, maybe early 70s. He might be upset that I age him this way, but I won't be mentioning his name. And he's based on the West Coast. And he wrote and asked me how I was doing and said that he was sorry to be a little late in asking me, but he's been so busy at the hospital. And his normal position is not 24/7 at a hospital. He has a private practice, and yes, he would go to the hospital at times. But if you're at a hospital now, the patients that are being treated are the people that are seen as having coronavirus. And also, they're therefore in a context where contagion is possible. So we do see more and more an awareness of that. And in fact, in a number of countries, one in particular, you have the attempt of the government to get more doctors and medical people by, in fact, looking at their immigrant population, which has medical people and nurses, but people who, in coming to this Western country, haven't qualified or haven't yet qualified to practice there and reaching out to them because they become a large pool of people to reach out to. I can think in my own country of actually this people who are citizens and functioning very well. One of the largest, if not the largest, organization of physicians in America, and many of these people are, first of all, they're citizens, but they're first, second, third generation, is the Pakistan physician organization, a very, very large. So you can imagine today how in many parts of America where people may not have been exposed to people who are Muslim, or for that matter, to people who are Hindu, or people of, you know, who are brown, people who are black, who now will, when they go to hospital, a good deal of the people who take care of them, or who are either, you know, physicians and nurses, or who are the people who bring the food, the people who clean the offices. There's that interaction, and when that happens a lot, you get that sense of community. You know, we know from, for example, Gallup data. I used to be associated with the Gallup organization, and we looked at and then did a book called "Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think." One of the things you find is that if somebody knows a Muslim well personally, and this would be true for almost anything, if you know somebody of another faith, but maybe the only one of that other faith or that ethnic group, but you know them really personally and they're really good people, that easily affects you when you hear somebody generalize and say, well, look at the way the Pakistanis are, look at the way Muslims are, or look at the way Latino Catholics are. So, I mean, all of that is very important. And then, finally, I think we need to be concerned about watching our leaders, some of our leaders who will use the threat of the coronavirus to actually simply enhance their power. So, for example, in Hungary, you have a president that winds up getting his parliament to declare such a state of an emergency that, in fact, he has unbridled power and authority. In other countries, you may see prime ministers or presidents in Western countries who basically, in a crisis, interpret the idea that we're in a crisis, and therefore, in this crisis, I should have the final authority. And you see that debate in the United States. If you're looking at the media yesterday and today, that is, between the president and many governors of states. Now, governors of states will certainly say that they respect the presidency and the authority of the presidency, but what they also will respectfully say is, no, you don't have absolute authority to deal with this situation or that situation. For example, to deal with when to declare that we can back off the sheltering, or to deal with when to declare within a particular state or locale when the economy, or when, if you will, the corporate sector, et cetera, banks, restaurants can be opened. And so in that case, it becomes important, because otherwise, in addressing a pandemic, a medical pandemic, we can contribute to a mini pandemic globally if we see leaders using the context to simply arrogate more power to themselves, or to just, in the guise of what's going on, to actually become even more authoritarian than they are normally with their own government. Egypt would be an example of that, but one could think of a lot of other countries. The areas that I study, I would say, in a number of countries of the Middle East, because that's the area that I spent my most time in. Okay, I'll end there and be happy to discuss anything.
Thank you very much for that talk, Professor. Just before we move to the question and answer discussion, so again, if you do have questions, please put them in the text format in the chat window, or again, if you have an intervention, you can use the raise hand function in the application, and we'll get to you once we do that. Before we move on to open up the floor, I just want to pass over the floor to President of the Sharq Forum, Mr. Waddah Khanfar, who would like to, I believe, ask a question. So the floor is yours, Mr. Waddah.
John, thank you very much. I appreciate the fact that you have joined us today. It is very good to see you always and to hear you. I know that you are amongst few in this world that understand, communicate, and grasp the meaning of and the feelings in the Islamic world. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much for your participation. In fact, one of the most important things that are happening right now amongst a lot of people, especially young people in the Islamic world, while they are going through this crisis, the pandemic, and thinking about the aftermath of it, is the following thought. Of course, there is a fear that the world will be much more nationalistic, right-wing. Maybe there will be a rise of Islamophobia against some minorities in the West because of the economic crisis and what kind of environment that might happen because of it. Now, is there anything that we Muslims in the Muslim minorities who spoke now about magnificent ideas, but what about the rest of the Islamic world? Do you feel that the Islamic world at this stage can do something, Islamic values that could participate in building a new discourse in the world? From your understanding and your excellent grasp of Islam, do you feel that there is some room for us to participate in a grand debate and dialogue, grand alliance with other forces, to start thinking, exchanging thoughts and ideas about alternatives, political, economic, social, and so on? Thank you very much.
Yes, I do. I think it's a very good question. I mean, let me begin by saying that, not to show my age, but I've been interacting with Muslims rather intensively since the late 60s, early 70s, when I was doing my doctorate and then, traveling a lot in the Muslim world. And, we're at an incredible stage today. I mean, all these years later, to begin with, in terms of just resources for the kind of thing you're talking about, we have so many more Muslim men and women, and certainly today, young men and women who've had access to good educations, developed good skills, who, because of the internet, et cetera, have a sense of the global world, okay, which I think young people can easily forget. I mean, I can remember a time when, when foreign students would wind up, coming in and saying, particularly from the Muslim world, but also from other places, let's say in America, they'd come to America and they'd be saying they couldn't believe the kinds of questions people were asking them. And some of the kids, for example, would come from an elite background, good education, and people would be thinking that they were somehow living, in some sort of remote area with no access to any kind of education. All of that's changed. And Islam itself presents a resource. And the resource is twofold here. And that is, again, in Islam, as in other religious traditions, in recent decades, you see religious leaders more and more, a fair number of them, not all, who really realize that religion is more than ritual. Religion is more than just laws. Religion is, that God, for example, in Islam, the Quran tells us that God created the world and that it was a trust given, and that Muslims were to be carrying out God's will in that world. Well, that has all kinds of implications with regard to the world in terms of energy and climate, but very strongly, the message of social justice in Islam is overpowering. And I say that from a comparative perspective, because I've been trained in 4 different religions: Christianity, Islam primarily, Hinduism, and also Buddhism. And they all have a sense of social justice. But what I'm trying to say is that Islam's sense of social justice is incredible, and also the sense of the ummah. The idea that therefore I'm not just a single Muslim and a single Muslim that belongs in my local community, or if you will, in my national community, but I'm involved in a global community. And we know that that sentiment is there for many, including the older generation, when it comes to, for example, popular concerns, Palestine, the liberation of Palestine, etc. But I think that this is very much a time when given the variety of things that we're facing, groups, in particular organizations that would be youth-oriented, become very important. And when I say youth, this should be, I used to kid about this about the Muslim world. You know, I'd go to and see, for example, a major religious leader or the head of a group, whether it was a Muslim brother or anything else. And then I'd say, I'd like to see some of your young people. And they bring in somebody who was like in his early 40s, you know, or maybe late 30s, early 40s. And I used to say, that's great. So you're a youth in your 40s. By your 50s, you're getting a bit older. And then you become a senior when you're about 70. The reality of it is that you have now the opportunity to create youth organizations where you have people who have an expertise and provide a kind of direction to young people who have training in different areas, but need guidance on how they can take that which they have and learned and make for a better world. Now, this is something that, in a way, many people face who are good people. That is, for many people, you know, you can get into making it through law school, medical school, etc. But even with that, and you feel you're doing something good for society, there's always that sense of, but, you know, what about the broader society, you know? And I think in Islam, you can make a strong argument for whether people like it or not, that they have to be concerned about these issues, and particularly issues of social justice, of human rights, not only in their country and in their part of the world, but globally. And I think that that's what the challenge is. And I see this play out a bit. I teach in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and we have a fair number of foreign students and a fair number of Muslim students. And I do see in my classes, some of the sharpest people are some of my Muslim students, men and women, who interacting with those who aren't. And when we are studying all kinds of issues, the issue of religion and violence, the issue of democratization, etc., they're able to bring to bear and talk about it in terms of the politics and the international relations, but to have as part of that, as a base, you know, a sense of values. In other words, that politics and international relations have values, and avoid what was said a number of years ago by a variety of people, both prominent politicians and then some people who have seemed to have a genetic problem with Islam, like Daniel Pipes, that really, you know, when it comes to nations, etc., human rights should be very low on the ladder. You know, a great criticism of Jimmy Carter was he was too concerned with human rights. No, you know, and I think in Islam, I mean, that it's integral to Islam. It seems to me that if you are really going to follow God, and that doing that means a concern for the world, and yes, the ummah, but the broader ummah as well, the global community.
Thank you for that, Professor. Just before we get to some questions coming on the chat, I just wanted to follow up with sort of that point. You know, and talk about the conception of the common good. And in times like this, where you've spoken about how, in a very different way than previously, people have realized their level of interconnectedness. And we spoke a little bit about the role of religious communities, mostly on the positive side, but of course on the negative side as well. I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit to, you know, in the context of this interconnectedness and pluralism, how can religious communities, in particular, different religious communities, come together to find some notions of the common good, you know, moving forward?
I think that what we have, we've had some good examples in recent years. The bad side is that I've never seen things, as, from my point of view, as negative as they are. And I talked to people who were in graduate school and then served in government, you know, in my time, you know, so over all these years. And at one point, you know, we will say is we thought the world would be a lot better We thought we would see peace in Palestine. We knew surely in our lifetime it would. I used to say that I felt sorry for people who studied the Middle East and worked on Palestine and were retiring and dying. It was like, a medical person who worked on a disease and never got to do the cure, and I knew in my lifetime what would happen. Well, I mean, what do we see? We also saw the world getting more pluralistic in many ways, with some of the major religious leaders and with events like Vatican II in Catholicism and the dialogue between Muslims and Christians. But what have we seen in recent years also? A rise not only of the political right, but also of a religious right, which is very problematic. But I believe that the people are there. That is the leaders who've been saying and making the right kinds of statements in each faith. If you look around, they're there and talking about, when they talk about faith, they're not just people that talk about faith in the narrow sense, and that's okay. To be a good what is to meditate regularly, to go to services regularly, but they're people who plug it into the world in which one finds oneself. So you can't be a good and concerned person if you're not concerned about your neighbor. And in today's world, your neighbor is not just the person on the block you live on. It's not just the person in the city. It can be the people in your country, and it can also be globally. And I think when you look at, for example, things like philanthropy, you begin to see that it's not just philanthropy for your group. When I grew up, again, and this was true for Muslims in the early stage and for Jews, if you were giving money, you gave it solely to your church, your Catholic high school or university, your whatever. That changes. And when we had problems with Katrina, for example, and other issues, you'd find Muslim relief moving in. And in other areas of the world, you find Catholic relief or Protestant relief organizations. I think that's there. I think, though, what we do need is more context and more forums in which that are geared towards young people. Now, that occurs, but nowhere near where I think it should be. One of the phenomena that I have found in my career is I speak at a lot of Muslim fundraisers, and other kinds of organizations. And the best times would be when I would talk about the way I'm talking now, and the number of youth that would come up after to talk about it. People from the age of 14 to the age of 30, 35. And especially at times I would spin it to try to say, this is not just an issue, but as I understand your faith and as I see it playing through, this direction, this is what we should be concerned about. And I see this across faiths. We have a project called The Bridge, Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia, okay? And that project, just like the center that I had, consists of Muslims, Catholics, and Protestants. And on The Bridge, just by coincidence, we hire the best people. And by coincidence, I would say 75% of our senior researchers, maybe more than that, are Muslim. So, it's there. The desires are there on the part of young people. And I think ways for this to be done in really good and imaginative ways. I think it's important to have a lot of forums for young people where that and where they really have to be challenged. I also want to say that. I mean, the thing I've learned is speaking is you don't just talk about the ideals and then everybody goes, mashallah, they feel good and then they walk away. It's the way we used to handle fundraisers for Palestine. You go to a fundraiser, you talk about Palestine, we weep, we cry, we wrench our garments, and then we just go home. And we feel good because we did this and nobody else did it, but we don't think to ourselves, what should the follow-up be? What do I do? Is it donating a significant amount of money? Is it, going to work for X or Y? And I think that those kinds of possibilities are there. And I see this consciousness raised, I mean, just in passing, because I happen to be associated with the Alliance of Civilizations. I've seen that for a long time coming out of Qatar itself, with the work the Sheikh Moza does, with the kinds of programs that you have now in the universities. But I think we need to see more and more of that. And I think kids are ready for it. And they're not even kids at their age now, but they're ready for it.
Thank you for that. So we'll go to a question now from one of the participants, which it's on a related note. So this question is from Suzanne, who is asking, Recently, the adhan has been called in Berlin and other European cities that have historically, of course, not been necessarily that Muslim friendly. What has been the cause of this change, and should we expect any backlash from it?
Well, it depends on what city, what place, what neighborhood. You know, again, years ago, it used to be funny because if you were raised, for example, I was raised Catholic in what's called cosmopolitan New York. And in my time, everybody I knew was Catholic and the neighborhoods around were Catholic. So you had churches ringing bells all the time, you know, and you were used to it. But the risk you would run would be at that time, if you had the adhan, you know, being said, that you'd wind up with some Catholics saying, gee, it interferes. I can't think when I hear this noise, you know, when in fact, you've got, you know, the call to prayer taking place. I do think that amidst the problems and the real problems that we have still with Islamophobia, as we do with anti-Semitism, and I would encourage anybody in the audience to go to bridge.georgetown.edu, bridge.georgetown.edu, and you'll see all kinds of material about what's going on positively, negatively, organizations. You'll see the best and worst pieces that are being published. We will list them every day. And I do think that there's certainly a big difference. You know, we're getting more and more used in our societies, even though the hijab can be still an issue, you know, that some people will go after. More and more, we're seeing that kind of acceptance taking place. But I think that it gets overshadowed by the fact that, and it's important that media cover things, but media tends to go for, if it bleeds, it leads. And too often, that's the only thing that's there. So I think it's fine, you know, and it should be a situation where you have a multi-religious neighborhood or whatever, you know, for bells to be ringing, for the adhan to be, you know, to be chanted, to be said, and let there be some objection, but turn it into a discussion, you know, a nasty debate, but turn it into a discussion. And again, I think one of the strengths that you have now more than years ago is that there are so many more Muslims who can actually handle that conversation. You know, that's not an insult to the older generation. It's that there are so many more Muslims who've been raised here, who are, you know, second generation or third, and who are able to raise and frame it in a constructive way, and to work with others. And one example I wanted to give before I forget it. You remember what happened when Trump put in the Muslim ban? That very night, when at the airports you had people of all kinds of diverse backgrounds coming there to support, not coming there and saying, "Oh, look at all those hijabs," you know, that's an issue. And you had people of different faiths. You had people who just belong to civil rights movements, etc. And we see more of that. And I think that also has to be encouraged in countries. And young Muslims who are doing it, we need to have more and more young Muslims with young others in these organizations, so that you've got a real kind of pluralistic, if you will, thought force and workforce.
Thank you for that. So another question, this one from Luqman, and it's also sort of along these lines, but perhaps more on the negative side. So he writes, with the corona pandemic, we've also had corona racism. You spoke a little bit about this, Professor, in the context of India. So Luqman, who is in the UK but hails from Sri Lanka, where corona racism appears to be coming up with the blessings of the majoritarian government there. So he's speaking specifically about today how Muslims in Sri Lanka are being denied burials despite WHO guidelines, as well as a UN intervention. He's asking what are the ways that we can actually counter these types of policies from an international activist or just generally international perspective?
Well, I think a number of things you need to do, and not to plug what I said before, if Luqman goes to bridge.georgetown.edu, you will see that we have been carrying pieces on this, as well as commentary on what's going on. So the first level is to really make people aware. We've had an awful lot more coverage on Sri Lanka, Myanmar, on the Uyghurs, you know, on a variety of situations that didn't, and getting it really as it were, accessible but in depth, so that one really fronts, not just says, well, you know, there's this discrimination going on, but you actually talk about the actual actions, as was just said here. What are the implications when it comes to issues of burial, or when it comes to the issues of violence, whether or not a community feels safe after something, you know? And I think that one can see there some very good pieces, and a number of those pieces happen to be written by European Muslims that are concerned, and some are of South Asian and Southeast Asian background. So they bring that also to the concern. But I think that's the kind of thing that we need to do. There needs to be a lot more exposure on the internet. I mean, that's where a lot of people get their news and their attitudes. And the problem is, as you know, if you look at studies, that Islamophobes have over the last decade or so, or a little bit more than that, received $220 million to engage in the kind of stuff that they engage in on the internet, the kind of promotion, et cetera. So it's important to be involved, you know, and as it were, using the internet, among other things, to refute as well as to get out what the realities are.
Absolutely, thank you for that. So you mentioned the Uyghur situation there. We have a question from Shalmin, specifically asking about, there's a lot of issues, of course, with China and the WHO that have come up recently. So she's asking, do you think the world will shun China for what some have deemed as their irresponsible cover-up of the pandemic? And in this context, what could this mean for the situation of the Uyghur Muslims in that country?
Yeah, that's a great question. You need a wiser man than I am. Boy, that sounded like I was humble. That's news. Thank you. Look, the reality of it is that you have long-standing tension to begin with on the international scene between China and many countries. You know, so we do have, for example, we have trade between the US and Europe and China, but there have always been major concerns. And there's even more of a concern now with regard to China because of the sense that China could emerge as, in fact, the #1 power, economically, et cetera. And for many Americans, for example, who are used to growing up and feeling that we were #1 economically and militarily, et cetera, there's an issue. There certainly is a concern about China and with regard to the coronavirus and you know, the truth that they may or may not have been said. I certainly don't buy into the use of the phrase, you know, the Chinese virus, or, you know, et cetera, as has been used by President Trump. I think that what needs to be brought out, and it has come out more than I expected, is the Uyghur situation. That is, I've been surprised, although it took quite a while, the amount of media coverage that then started to emerge about the Uyghurs and really spelling out and refuting the idea that these were educational places, you know, and rather seeing them as concentration camps. And also the stories that get very, very explicit about what happens in Uyghur households in terms of the Quran, or in terms of there having some local Chinese official living in the house, you know, looking after people. I think that this situation becomes very important to highlight. But the reality of it is, in terms of international relations, that occurs on a number of levels. And so China is not going to be simply shunned to the extent that China or money, you know, that and to invest overseas, et cetera. That's going to be seen as desirable. To the extent that people realize that China, it also has a wide-ranging foreign aid program that definitely looks like it is, and is building up the idea that it is a major power. I think that will cause tension, but that's not going to solve all of the problems. It's not as if the world is going to turn against China.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, another issue that has come up frequently, of course, with Ramadan coming around the corner, there's been a lot of concern from or questions being raised from Muslims living in majority non-Muslim societies In the UK, for example, there was talk going around some political circles that, if families gather for Ramadan, that there's going to be a huge spike in COVID cases. So of course, while the pandemic has these enormous geopolitical implications, on the other hand, as Elif writing from London is asking us, how do you think this pandemic affects Islamophobia? Do you believe that the coronavirus is empowering racists or exposing the sort of idiocy of racism and discrimination? I think this one has come up fairly frequently, in circles I know as well for a lot of Muslims living in majority non-Muslim society. So if you could share some of your insight on that, that would be great.
Can you give me that sentence again? I want to make sure that I have a handle on exactly what's being said. Just give it back to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the context of Ramadan, in the UK, it's been said by some political officials that if families gathering for Ramadan dinners for the holy month, this may lead to a huge spike in COVID-19 cases. So the question is, in this context, how does the pandemic affect Islamophobia? Do you believe that it is mostly empowering this attitude, or whether it's actually exposing the problematic aspects of this racist and discriminatory discourse? And just sort of to add my own part to that, I think you spoke earlier about minorities in positions of what we call the new heroes, right? And in the UK, you mentioned in particular how a number of the medical staff who have passed away there from the virus were from Muslim backgrounds. So, taking this all into context, do you generally, do you believe that this pandemic could go in a sense of bringing out these ideas more, or actually exposing them for what they are?
Okay, well, first of all, when it comes to Islamophobia, and Britain has a really dark side when it comes to that, I mean, as does the US, you just have to understand, people who are the sort of really hardcore Islamophobia people, for me, it's almost genetic with them. It's not as if many of them are going to see the light go on. That's not what they want to do. So for them, they will take any occasion to make a case. So they might not care at all themselves about distancing themselves, but if they can have an occasion where they say, "See, it's this event and Muslims don't pay attention to this, so therefore they're spreading the corona." I mean, they'll make those kinds of statements. Okay, I think I'd like to just address the question, and hopefully people won't say, "Well, it's you're not a member of the community, so it's none of your business." I think it really is important that people, whether it's Ramadan or not, do and are conscious of what the medical experts in their country say. And I'll just give you an example. In myself, I have lots of friends who are Muslim physicians, for example. Actually, I don't think I have any friends who are non-Muslim physicians. I have to start seeing some people who are. But one of them recently came to visit me here. And I'm on sabbatical, and I'm living in, although I work in Georgetown, I'm living at a home that we have in Florida, which is ideal for sheltering oneself. It's on a small private island. It's very controlled, etc. And he came here and he said to me, "Well, here's some stuff, to your hands to wash." He said, "But actually, most of that, yeah, you should do it. But that's not what's really going to protect you." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, and he pointed to my front door. He said, "Don't go out of it and don't let anybody into it. And if they do come in, distance." And I think that's an issue that is being faced. I would encourage your listeners to go to the American Bar Association's website. They just had a discussion on the internet. I wasn't speaking, but I followed it, and it really had 5 top lawyers and talking about the impact of coronavirus on their faith and their practice. And so it had the executive director of Karama talking about the question of mosque attendance, Jummah prayer, distancing, etc. But you also have a prominent Jewish lawyer who's a lawyer, but it's also is a Jew and deals with these issues. And you could see how these communities are struggling with it because they are communities where it is group that brings you together, and it's important. Christians ran into it just recently. For Christians, the idea that Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and that Easter itself, that you would not be in a church, but that the church was empty, and that you're doing it, via the internet was, beyond belief. But what some people have learned to do is to use even that connection that we have, to use it enough so that communities can stay in touch. And so with a lot of churches and mosques that I know now, they have a lot more programs even during the week, and people get on, and especially if they can see each other. And it goes, it works that way. What's going to happen when you want to celebrate Ramadan as a family? Then that becomes an issue. Is there a way in which one can do it by simply having people keep a certain distance? Now, for some people, if they're a very small quarter, that's an issue. But I've been in situations here where you can bring people together, and one has to look to one's religious leaders. But one of the things I would say here is what I say to anybody when we talk about religious leaders: never listen to one, listen to a number of them, unless it's somebody that you really know and you're an absolute follower of. Somebody says, in the old days they would say, Sheikh Adawi, that's my main person, or so and so. But when one is talking about issues of that are really significant, it's always good to get 2 or 3 opinions, whether it's a medical opinion or it's a matter of practice, especially if you don't know a lot about it and you want to have a sense of what does your faith say. Because I know in a number of faiths, you can see it in Catholicism, whatever, if you get a Catholic priest and you ask him, and he's a conservative Catholic priest, a question, it's going to be different than a more progressive. But he will answer it. The more conservative will say, this is the word of God. It's not my word, So it's important to know, who are you reading? Who are you listening to? Who are you talking to? And again, your communities in Europe more and more have really good people in recent years, and a diversity of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really interesting to point out, as we're ourselves gathering here and with people that we may not have otherwise been able to gather with. So the situation has brought us together in a sense. So just before we wrap up, I just want to sort of ask one more general point. If you could share some of your wisdom and your knowledge with us, and your final advice. We've spoken a lot about youth tonight. What might be your final advice for youth, particularly Muslim youth, both in Muslim majority countries and in the West, as we continue to sort of face these unknown days ahead?
I think that, communities, all religious communities, in the last 30 or 40 years, with the rapid change in the world, and then the way that played out, not only in changes in social mores, et cetera. You need only to look at film and see that there's stuff on film now or on TV that in my time would have simply not been there, or the way people are talking, or the way they're thinking. In recent years, I think that there's been, you've got more of, again, as I said earlier, you've got a fair number of the younger generation, and for the purpose of our conversation, that can be, I would say now, for people up to 40. In terms of their education, in terms of, for many of them, or where they been raised, what they've been exposed to, that their challenge often at that stage becomes, as you're moving forward, religiously for some, it's can I find a community in a mosque where I can feel at home and that it speaks to where I'm at, okay? I remember the example that I had from a good friend of mine whose father established a mosque many years ago, and who told me, he said that he was going to have to leave that mosque after 40 or 45 years because his 2 sons came home, and it turned out that the imam that they had was a super conservative imam, and they just couldn't, and they were in their 20s and very bright. but they just couldn't. They said, we can't go and sit and listen to this all the time. And so it showed that, okay, what some would do then is walk away. The same thing happens in Christianity. If you find that, that the church that you go to, or the faith for some people, you either go to another church, or for some people, after a while, it'll be, well, I'm not going to do it. And you look at that phenomenon. We now have the, the nuns, etc., and you look at the exodus from a number of religions. It's not just that people are leaving because they had an education and they don't believe in God anymore. For many of them, the faith that they had and have wasn't being fed in the religious context that they were. I think young people have a lot of opportunities here. I think with the amount of information that's available on the internet that comes alive. It's not like in the old days. What it meant was somebody had to give you books that you then got fired up on. If you had certain issues. Now, what's great is you can see some people live who are delivering their messages. And there is so much diversity to be exposed to. And I think the challenge that the Muslim community has, and the concern of the older generation is, and should be, is that the younger generation, not simply that too many of them, not simply become completely secularized, get caught up in their career, not able to, for whatever reason, feel that they can relate to and find a good religious community. I think now it's more this kind of, give and take. And I do see organizations here in the States, and I know that overseas, where you do have programs for young people. I just think it needs to be increased. And I also think that they need to be, in every meeting, you need to have somebody, at least one. All good speakers can challenge, but you need to have somebody who really shove it right into you. Really hit it out there and take that chance. Now, my analogies are always bad, okay? But the difference between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, even if they were talking about the same message, if you've listened to Bernie Sanders, the way he frames the words and his dynamism when he says it, and it's a dynamism that isn't fake as a speaker, it comes from within inside, then you realize, if you happen to agree with him, it comes alive and you really realize, oh my God, this is an important and living thing that he's talking about. You know what I mean? And it's not just a kind of an academic who prepares a talk and just pulls a few things together. I'm very optimistic about where we are and where things may move in the Muslim community. There's still a lot more to go, but the world has changed. The last time that we had a major search, all three of our candidates were American Muslims. It would have been inconceivable years before that there would have been that many people out there and with the kind of credentials, that were needed to do X. And I think that when I look at, what are modern or contemporary Muslims thinking or believing, or what are they saying, I see this kind of vitality. But I think one has to, again, be careful. Just because somebody is a charismatic speaker doesn't mean that they're, they're always correct. So you're always going to have that tension between, which Islamic scholar you're listening to, which religious leader you're listening to. But it's a much open playing field, and the very students that need to process this, many of them have the ability to do that. It's not like, for example, if you're in the old country, whether it was Italy for Catholics or parts of the Middle East or South Asia, where in fact somebody was young, but they didn't have a good education. They were raised to be a laborer and a worker. And then suddenly, they've got somebody who's telling them about their religion and what they should or shouldn't do. Now you have people who can really think through it, and are right, on top of it. And it's a cross section, because you have good religious leaders, many of them, not all, because it's true in all religions, but you also have good professionals. There are many professionals that I know, Muslim professionals, who are lawyers, who are doctors, who are et cetera, and are people of faith, not only in observing their faith, but in knowing their faith. That brings us to an end.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I apologize to those who we didn't get to your questions, but we've had a very engaging and fruitful discussion, and I think we should cut it there. On behalf of Sharq Forum, Professor Esposito, I'd really like to extend our thanks. It was an honor, a real privilege to have you join us here this evening, and we hope perhaps we can do it again sometime in the future.
Let me say that if they email me, I will at least read it, and if I can, I will respond to a question, or if they disagree with me or whatever.